Paul Vidich was a senior executive in the entertainment industry for 20 years before he turned to writing full-time. His fifth novel, The Matchmaker, A Spy in Berlin, was selected by the Washington Post as a top 10 noteworthy book of February and by Crime Reads as one of the most anticipated espionage novels of 2022. Currently, he serves as Vice Chairman, Board of Governors, the New School for School Research in New York City, and board member, Poets and Writers, a nonprofit literary organization. He served as a Wesleyan University trustee from 1966 to 1999 and was awarded its Distinguished Alumni Award in 2000. Jan Eliasberg is an award-winning writer and director. Her prolific directing career includes dramatic pilots for CBS, NBC, and ABC, such as Miami Vice and Wise Guy, countless episodes of television series including Bull, Nashville, Parenthood, The Magicians, Blue Bloods, NCIS Los Angeles, Supernatural, and dozens of others. She also has storied career as a screenwriter, writing films driven by strong female leads, including Fly Girls about the women air service pilots of World War II for Nicole Kidman and Cameron Diaz at Fox 2000, among many others. Hannah's War is her debut novel. Bought in a bidding war by Little Brown, it has sold 50,000 plus copies to date and has been translated into 7 languages and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Awards in fiction. And lastly, Stephen Schiff is a multi-award-winning screenwriter, TV writer, producer, and journalist. In TV, he was a writer and executive producer of the FX series The Americans, which ran from 2013 to 2018. More recently, he has been a writer and executive producer of the Showtime drama series Super Pumped: The Battle for Uber, a writer and consulting producer for the Disney Plus series Andor, and a consulting producer for Amazon's German language series Luden. A Pulitzer Prize finalist in distinguished criticism, Schiff was a staff writer at The New Yorker for 10 years and was Vanity's Fair critic at large for 9 years before that. I'm now gonna let our guest take it away.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for the introduction. And thanks, Jan and Stephen, for joining me here, and also for the many Wesleyan alum who are, I know, participating online. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, and then we're going to shift and we're going to talk about Wesleyan, our careers, and about spies and how each of us found a career path with spies. The Matchmaker, which is the 5th book, is set in Berlin in 1989. And I'm often asked, why Berlin? And the answer is that there were 50 years of spying in Berlin, from Kristallnacht in 1938 until 1989 when the wall fell. And so it's this hotbed of intrigue and deception, lies, where the Soviet Union, England, France, and the United States sort of met at a boundary between the opposing forces of the Cold War. So as Khrushchev said, that's where the spies are. It's a swampland of spies. And so if you're a writer of spy novels, you inevitably find a book that you set in Berlin. In my case, the Berlin I chose to examine was the Berlin of the Stasi, particularly at the end of the GDR. The Stasi were a remarkably efficient organization. We think of ourselves as living in a surveillance society today with apps that control what you see, where you're seen, who listens into your phone calls, and people know where you are if they have the ability to track your cell phones. But Stasi were even more efficient at following people and knowing about their lives. 1 in 7 East Germans either worked for the Stasi or was an informant. And so I found that a fascinating situation to explore. And the premise of the book came from a book written by a guy named Marcus Wolf, who was the head of counterintelligence in Germany. a very clever man, a very smart man, whose parents had been communists in Germany, were escaped to Moscow, and then he returned with the Red Army after the war and set up the counterintelligence division of the Stasi. And he, among other things, like many men in espionage, used sex as tradecraft, except he expanded and made it sort of more sophisticated. He made love tradecraft, and he created a network of what he called Romeos, who were East Germans who went to West Germany, met young women who were vulnerable in one way or another, and then began dating them. And often they were unaware of the fact that the person they were going out with were spies. And in some cases they married. And of course, the thing that developed after the wall fall is many of these women discovered that they had been living a remarkable deception, a lie. And that intrigued me. There are lies in marriages all the time. I've been married 45 years and I still discover things about my wife I didn't know. But when the person you're sleeping with and that you're married to, who you think you know, is not somebody you know, but in fact is this vast deception. That's it. For me, that became a very interesting premise to launch a spy novel around. And in a way, my best training for writing about spies came when I was at Wesleyan. That's not an intuitive thought, but it's something I've come to understand. I went to the CSS, and the CSS taught us how to think and how to analyze, but most importantly, it taught us how to think beneath the assumptions of what an author was writing. What were the preconceptions that didn't appear on the page, but were inherent in the argument? And in a way, that's what spies do. Spies sort of, not only do they lie themselves, but they have to understand how other people lie. They have to understand how other people misinform and how other people misconceive situations. So in some ways, that intellectual training is a thing that I've turned into part of my own writing tradecraft, as it were. So I'm sort of drawing my career back to Wesleyan. Although when I left Wesleyan, if you'd asked me that, did I ever expect I would either write a novel or particularly a novel about spies, I would have said, of course not. Why would I do that? When I left Wesleyan, I wanted to make movies like Stephen, you did, and like Jan, you did. Of course, I never did. So I ended up, writing novels about it. But having said that, I'm sort of curious how each of you has, when you think about your career and you think about who you were when you left Wesleyan, as a young 22-year-old, did you imagine you would be doing what you're doing now? And let me just start with Jan and then Stephen.
I did not. When I left Wesleyan, I went to live in London. I wanted to be a director. I wanted to be a theater director specifically. And the reason that I was in London was because London has a tradition of theater that was the theater that I loved, which was revisiting the classics and putting a very contemporary stamp on them, or having a directorial point of view. And, the idea that you could go and see 3 productions of Measure for Measure or 5 productions of a Brecht play and have 3 different stories told to you was exciting to me. And that was very much what I wanted to do as a director. And when I came back to America, I came back to go to Yale Drama School, where I was able to have my 10,000 hours of directing. And was I guess really fortunate because my classmates were Fran McDormand and Tony Shalhoub and John Turturro. So it was 10,000 great hours of directing. But when I got out into the cold world, all of those grand ideas about Shakespeare and Brecht and Measure for Measure I was hit with the fact that America doesn't really support theater in that way. You can do one Shakespeare play if it's Midsummer Night's Dream, but really there's more support for things like The Christmas Carol. So why I thought it would be easier to do such things in film is completely baffling, and I will never understand that. But I certainly, as a director, I was very intrigued by filmmaking. How can you not be? And I was very, very drawn to film at Wesleyan, where I took Janine Bassinger's course, Hawks and Hitchcock, many, many spies in those movies. And interestingly, I would say that the first thing that I was asked to direct was Miami Vice. And Miami Vice was about undercover cops who became so close to the people that they were trying to catch that they almost blurred the lines, that they often did blur the lines, which is very much what spies do. So I do see that there was an interesting way in which spy stories do allow you to paint pictures of this larger world where you see the tears in the social fabric. And as I got more and more of my own voice, more and more of my own stories, I started to write, as was said in the introduction, screenplays. And I was writing the story of the women air service pilots in World War II. I'll do this very quickly. And I was researching it, and I was reading the New York Times on the day we bombed Hiroshima. And I saw in the history of the development of the atomic bomb that the key component that had allowed the Allies to develop the atomic bomb was brought to the Allies by a female non-Aryan physicist. And that became the inspiration for what eventually became Hannah's War. There's a long story about how spies developed, but I will save that for later or never.
Stephen, to jump to you, you were a big part of The Americans, which is a remarkable story about Russian illegals. And I'm curious how you came to be a scriptwriter there.
Well, that was so for some years before that, I had been a journalist for half a lifetime, and then had the opportunity to become a screenwriter. That's another story I can tell. Actually, Paul, I think you've heard it, and some of our attendees probably have heard it. But in any case, I had been writing movies for many years, and kind of being falsely snobby, absurdly snobby about television. But then, of course, as we all know, television began to change, and movies began to change, and suddenly the ability to tell a novelistic story in television made itself apparent, and that was rather new and interesting, and that had not really revealed itself entirely by the time I was asked to join The Americans, but the possibility seemed to be there, and I had been watching The Americans and thinking about television, and I had watched one season of it. That was all there had been. In fact, I'd watched half a season. There had not yet been a full season. When I was called in, my agent said, would you like to do TV? This seems like you. And it's also in New York, which was, I managed to have mounted this whole sort of career in the movie business without ever moving to Los Angeles. And so I went in and talked to him, and it was instant. Oddly, I had delved into similar material in my screenwriting life earlier for a producer named Frank Marshall. I had done a movie. I had written a movie called The Charm School, which was based
Nelson
on
DeMille.
Nelson DeMille novel, which was an unintentional prequel to The Americans. It was written before
Right.
Americans was a glimmer in anyone's eye, and it was about a school for these kind of illegals whom spies find in American CIA agents, of course posing as other things in the Soviet Union, find in the woods north of Moscow. And I had set that in the early 80s, which is kind of the period of the Americans. And at that time, at the time that I wrote it, everyone was saying, you know what, no one's really interested in Russia. So it sort of got set aside. The Americans was probably an influence, but there were probably other influences on a renewal of interest in Russia. And Frank Marshall, the indefatigable producer of the movie, decided, let's see if we can get this made now. And I have a relatively brand new contract with Universal now to rewrite The Charm School as a motion picture. That's one of the projects I'm so happily working on. So in long story short, I went in and had done a lot of thinking about this sort of thing, and had also read the Metronome Archives, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Paul, which were archives that were, once the Soviet Union fell, a lot of information started coming out, and these massive books full of stuff about the KGB started coming out, and their exploits were always suspected and more. And so I was raring to go with the Americans and joined that team, starting with season 2, at which point they really wanted to revamp the show in this way that I'm talking about, which is to say, season 1, they didn't quite know whether it was going to be episodic, sort of a new procedural spy story every episode, or what it was going to be. The show was very well received its first season, but it also was not a big audience attracting show at FX. And the very courageous head of FX, John Landgraf, whom I always call the philosopher king, made a decision then to the question was, do we change the show and try to attract a bigger audience, or do we let the show be the best show it can possibly be? And strangely, especially for a basic cable network dependent on advertising, he decided to do the latter. And that allowed us to do an extreme form of serialized television that I was very interested in. We got quite, in television, it's often thought of, you have a story, you have a B story, you have a C story. We would have directors looking at our episodes and saying, you have a D story, an E story, an F story, a G story, an H story, and it was like that. And we didn't mind, because our audience, we learned, was small, but very much up to it. And so I was, to lean a little more into the spy part of what you're asking, Paul, I was already I had my spy antenna already there, but that was a deep plunge that I very much enjoyed.
Well, I think also that, Le Carré has said this, and you interviewed him wonderfully, I think, in Vanity Fair, and you may even have gotten this out of him, so I'm quoting you, quoting him. But he was saying that a spy story isn't just a spy story, it's a love story. It's about betrayal, it's about friendship, it's about a class of men in England, in his case, who rise up as a cohort. And he used spies simply as a prism through which to talk about a lot of social and political issues that were interesting to him. And when he did his best work, he sort of stuck within the guardrails of that genre. When he did what I think is his worst work, he tried to stray a bit and deliver, more literary novels, but they were actually less effective. But, I think one reason the Americans worked well is because you had ordinary people living ordinary lives with these deep secrets. And so you were always empathizing with the risks they were taking, but also empathizing with them as parents, as, you know, potential colleagues. And that's the thing that I think, you know, that we're all sort of in some way or another using spies in our work. But I think it's because spies right now are, you know, they represent a certain aspect of the world in a way they didn't in the 60s and certainly in the 50s. You know, the CIA didn't really get created until 47. There was one reference to the CIA in North by Northwest, which I only got when I resaw it about 5 months ago. But it was basically a spy story, but you never think of it that way. Jan, go ahead.
Well, just on that subject, exactly. In Hannah's War, I have an investigator who comes to Los Alamos because they believe that there is a spy who is leaking secrets. And initially, I was going to have him be a CIA agent. And then I started to do my research and I realized that wasn't possible because there wasn't any CIA. And in fact, there wasn't even any OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. He was sort of right at, in the story, in fact, 1945, he is right at that moment when the OSS is about to be built by Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan. And it was interesting because when I try to describe the book, I can't really say he's a CIA agent or an OSS agent, but I kind of say Army intelligence officer, which is kind of all purpose and it works. The other thing I wanted to mention about spies is that I think if you are looking to investigate questions of identity and who people present themselves to be and who they really are, spying it's a very good metaphor for people who are keeping secrets in marriages, as in The Matchmaker, but also secrets from themselves even.
I worked at Time Warner for 18 years and no one there, and during those 18 years, knew I secretly wanted to write novels. And when I left my job and say, I'm going to give up my big office and my big salary, they said, why? And I said, I want to write. And the demands of writing were such that, and I had had that as a secret, you know, in my career, because I thought if people know that about me, I'll be considered less serious of an executive. And that probably was my own issue. So it was a secret. And you know, I
think it's true. You know, in a way, we're all. I think the attraction of the spy genre is that we recognize that we're all spies in our own lives, in one way or another. And you know, some of us keep a lot of secrets. Some of us keep a few. Some of us keep more in our marriage. Some of us keep less. More in our job, less. All that. But part of what, you know, animated the Americans, and I think animates, you know, the best spy fiction, is the conflict between the fact that you want to, you know, part of you is secret and part of you wishes to be known. And we wish to be known by our partner in our relationship. We wish at, you know, our spies on the Americans always had this they were having affairs. They were performing what we call it, I believe the term was invented by Le Carré, honey traps. And you know, they had to be very effective at having relationships that weren't real to them. One of our, you know, chief characters, in fact, married someone. And yet, when you get back to the person that you're really, really with, a part of you just wants to open up everything. What do we dare to open up? What can we never open up? How can we tell? I think so much of that is at the heart of what is the fascination of the spy genre.
Yeah, Joe Cannon, who's a writer in the genre, who's got a book coming out, I think it's actually tomorrow, The Berlin Exchange, says about lying and spies, he says, you know, we all lie in our lives a little bit, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on who we're talking to and, you know, what we're trying to accomplish. But spies are interesting because they lie for a living. They do it professionally. And as professionals, they are very good at it, and they're trained to be good at it. And they're living, lying to friends in one way, family in another way. And as you said, Stephen, they're lying to themselves often. And particularly when it comes to what I'll call the justifications for some of the moral and ethical choices they make, which is the thing that I'm excited about in my books that I explore, which is, you do something that is extrajudicial outside of the United States, and you may have been raised morally and ethically. And when you're put in a position where you do something that's, quasi-legal, you justify it because the ends justify the means. National security, actions in pursuit of national security is this big umbrella, this big tent under which many terrible things are justified. And I think all of that, in our current world makes this genre exciting and interesting. And it is actually reverberates with what we read in the press, what we, see in social media. And so I think
about that, I mean, it's you pose the question of when sort of there's a fluctuation between interest in spy stuff and less interest, but certainly in the time that we were all in college together, and a few years after, the realization that the American government, for instance, had been lying a lot about Vietnam, and that there were just a lot of things that we thought we knew that we didn't know, followed by Watergate, of all things, followed by the next year, the church hearings exposing what the CIA had been up to. There's a sense in which we could never go back from that. And what was that about? That was about a relatively sudden, historically speaking, descendance of mistrust, a feeling of, I can't trust people, I can't trust institutions, I can't trust my country, I can't trust this government that I pay taxes to and depend on for justice and security. What can I trust? And I think, it makes me optimistic kind of about the spy genre, if not about the world, to feel like that trust ain't coming back. And so these questions are going to remain alive.
I'm going to go back even further because I think that's a great point. But I was dealing also with issues of trust because I was very interested in this race between the Allies and the Germans to develop the atomic bomb, and how the Eastern European scientists and the Jewish scientists who were horrified at what they were seeing and thought that Germany was going to get the bomb came over to America, literally begged Albert Einstein to write a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to create the Manhattan Project, which he did. But then this fascinating thing happened because the Manhattan Project was a collection of brilliant scientists who were working on essentially a military weapon, and a weapon of mass destruction, the first weapon of mass destruction. And so there was the military and the government who were kind of overseeing them. And the scientists didn't really want to be reporting to the military. I mean, there's some actually very funny things like Hans Bethe, who was a great mathematician. He was recruited by Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer said he was going to have to be a member of the army, and he was going to have to wear a uniform and be a lieutenant or something. And Bethe said, I will work on the atomic bomb as a scientist. I will not work on the atomic bomb as a colonel, and I will not wear a uniform, because for him, it was the pure science. But all of the military, all the political people were sort of waiting for the scientists to make their breakthrough. And the scientists didn't really understand exactly. I mean, they knew what they were creating, but they had no idea that they were not going to be able to control it in any way once they had created it. And the government was literally going to take it away, use it immediately, use it to bomb, fairly non-strategic cities in Japan in a war that we had basically already won. So the issues of trust there, I found absolutely fascinating, because everybody was there to make sure that Hitler didn't get the bomb,
Yeah, there was an interesting shift between the beginning of World War II and I'll say the beginning of the Cold War, and that would be about 1949, 1950. And I would characterize the sort of World War II element is a movie that is black and white, that is sort of romantic, and sort of draws us in with a sort of optimism about the future. Whereas in 1949, The Third Man, which is this brilliant Carol Reed novel, so it has the same romance, but it's set in divided Austria, Vienna. And it is got this sort of deep moral corruption and corrosion that you're left with at the end of the novel, and it's sort of a gray, morally ambiguous story that represents what happened after World War II. So the optimism that we can sort of go off into the world and we can create a better world, which is what happened after World War II in the United States, really was shattered by what happened during the 50s and the early 60s, when we found ourselves doing some of the same bad things that had been done by other empires in the 30s and the 40s.
Well, one of the things I discovered in my research was that the Cold War actually started before World War II was over, because there's a wonderful documentary called The Day After Trinity, where all of this inner circle of scientists were interviewed. And one of them talks about how morally, when VE Day happened, and certainly when Hitler committed suicide, he says, I feel like every fiber of my being, in a moral sense, I should have turned on my heel and walked out of there and never looked back. But we were already targeting Russia. There were Groves, who ran the project for the military, really, in many ways, wanted to drop the bomb more to prove to Russia that we had it and that we were willing to use it, than to sort of be the white knight. I mean, the war in Europe was over and we had won. So I would kind of say that curdling and that beginning of the Cold War started, it came to full flower in like the late 40s, but I think it started in 44, 45.
So I'm curious what each of you is working on now that you can talk about or choose to talk about. Jan, have you got another book?
I do. So Hannah's War has been acquired for film, and I just finished an adaptation, which I feel quite good about, and I'm actually attached to direct now. We know Hollywood. My fingers are crossed, but I'm not counting on anything. So that's just going along. But in the meantime, I'm working on a second book, which is about that shift that I was just talking about. It's about the fact that that the Americans started to make deals with high-level Nazis. The CIA started to recruit Nazis, support them, give them money if they felt that these Nazis had information about Russia. And so a lot of the Jews in Israel, the Mossad, couldn't go after these guys because they were protected by America.
Right.
And this has grown out of things that I discovered while I was researching Hannah's War, and a particular character in the book who kind of leaves Hannah's War halfway through. So this is, in a sense, a sequel, but it's also a standalone book because you don't have to have read Hannah's War. But it is about the formation of the Mossad. It's about the justifications behind the formation of Israel. Does have a female lead, as all my projects do. And so I'm working on that.
So Stephen, let me ask you, but before I do, it's sort of my next novel, which is pretty much done, is also features a female lead, also features Mossad, but it's a different Mossad. It's takes place in 2006 during the 34-day war between Hezbollah and Mossad. Mm. And the politics in the Middle East are so complicated, and the spying is so complicated. I decided to test my the complexities with a few characters that I'm inventing here. But so I'm going from the Cold War to the War on Terror, which is sort of a leap. It's a different type of character. It's a different type of, the CIA is a different organization. Stephen?
I have a somewhat full plate at the moment. I'm doing the movie that I described earlier. I have a TV show, a series, multi-season series that was just greenlit around Christmas time by HBO Max. That's based on a DC Comics. I don't think I should probably say too much about it, but we'll be shooting it in London starting probably in July or August. So I'll be moving to London for about a year, as I did in the year 2020, which I love. I love London. Amazon has asked for a second season of the German TV show that you heard mentioned in the intro that I've been supervising for them, which is about Hamburg, the red light district of Hamburg in the early 80s. It's being done by a team of German writers. They're wonderful. Everything is translated for me. They speak very good English, but they don't think they do. And it's a crazy, wild sort of side project that I have so enjoyed doing. And I'm also about to start a show that'll be a limited series that I'll write all the episodes, 6 episodes, about a famous female war photographer, whose name I probably also shouldn't mention in this context, but that will be for Paramount.
Was that photographer in Vietnam as well? Did she die in Vietnam?
No, this is a contemporary person who's just now probably in her early 40s. Oh, and I should say again, Super Pumped, which I worked on, will be on Showtime starting February 27th. So watch and enjoy. Yeah.
So when you left Wesleyan, when we graduated, we left Foss Hill, you made your cap, you threw it into the audience. Did you think you would be a screenwriter, script writer? Was that something you thought about?
Earlier, when you spoke about this earlier, you said that Jan and I left Wesleyan with dreams of being in the film business, but I had no such dream whatsoever. You might recall, maybe other people on this call will recall, that I had a band. I formed of Wesleyan members. Maybe, I don't know whether they're tuning in tonight, but John Manchin were on guitar and Dan Gleish on bass and Eric Von Allman on drums, and we actually made a profession of that for the first few years out of Wesleyan. And then I began to realize the life of a musician was not all I had thought it might be. And in fact, the more we worked, we were then in a band, John and I at least were, that played around the New England area, virtually working every night. And the more we worked, the less I liked it. And I began to hope for a writing career, which I thought I would enjoy. And as everyone who knew me at Wesleyan probably knows, I love to pontificate about movies. And so I love the movies, and I saw so many movies at Wesleyan that just enhanced my movie education so much. And I became a film critic in Boston at the alternative weeklies there, particularly the Boston Phoenix. My first boss was Janet Maslin there. I had come over from the Real Paper where David Anson was my very first boss. Janet was replaced by David Denby. So I was in a line of film critics. I trained Owen Gleiberman, who's now the film critic of Variety, David Edelstein, whose name you might know. And that was what I thought I wanted to do. And then I was asked to come to Vanity Fair and be their film critic. And at a certain point, Tina Brown called me in and said, you know, Stephen, a funny thing happened. Eddie Murphy refused to be on our cover. And it seems to be about something you wrote in the back of the book. And she said, I love your writing. I want you to write for us. I don't need a film critic. Would you start branching out a bit? And so I did, and never really looked back. And when we were going to make the transition to the New Yorker, because I went with Tina, she was saying, if you want to be the film critic of the New Yorker, you can be, but I hope you say no. And I felt the walls closing in at the prospect, and I did say no. And so pursued a journalistic career. And that was all I really wanted to do or be then. I got an opportunity some years later to write the screenplay for Lolita, which was like, wow, yeah, I'll try that. And it got made into the movie of Lolita with Jeremy Irons, directed by Adrian Lyne. And then I was off and running in a very different direction. So there's a sort of serendipity to it. And to just finish the story with the Wesleyan connection, I didn't take film at Wesleyan. And I didn't major in anything that now exists. For a while, I was at the College of Letters. But for about 10 minutes at Wesleyan, you could put together your own major if you could convince this dean that it made sense. And I can't remember the dean's name. And we were talking before the Zoom, and Paul said, Seth Davis, if you're out there, you'll remember the dean's name, which I really believe, knowing Seth. And I went to this dean and I said, I would like to apply for the university major, which was the umbrella term. And I want it to be in myth. And I listed the courses and gave him an argument of why there should be a myth major. And I graduated Wesleyan as a myth major, which prepared me only to do exactly what I've done and nothing else.
Well, that's a myth, I think, right? Isn't that the myth you lived?
That's the myth I lived. Yeah, I'm living it now.
Well, I think we have questions now. If I see Victoria has rejoined the group.
Yes, we do. We have a lot of audience questions. First, we did have a response from Seth. I'm not sure on pronunciations here. Adamani, Krieger.
Adamani, right.
Krieger.
Those are the two names that he gave. So I don't know if either of those ring a bell. But...
well done, Seth. We knew.
Okay, so first audience question. How do each of the authors think the Nazis would have taken advantage of the current high-tech surveillance abilities afforded now versus 30 or 85 or 90 years ago?
I personally think very much the way the Russians and the Chinese are, except perhaps they would have by now gotten more aggressive.
This is not an answer to the question, but it's a big plug for the movie The Lives of Others, because you were talking, Paul, about the Stasi and how extremely well organized they were. And I think you had wanted us to talk about some of our favorite movies and books about spies, and that is one of my very favorite. It's about a Stasi spy who sets up operation above the apartment of a playwright and his actress girlfriend, and how their interactions begin to change him. It is not at all what you expect, and it's quite a brilliant film, I think.
I agree.
Yeah, I would answer that the things that we have today, which are highly sophisticated and all technology based, facial recognition, keystroke monitoring, all those things are techniques to surveil. But what the Nazis did is they went one step further, is there were consequences. They were a brutal and repressive country. And so when you have the techniques of surveillance and then the brutality of the consequences, that's a bad place to be. And I think we all have given up a great deal of our privacy now as a result of all of this surveillance. And we do it sort of voluntarily, but we also don't see the consequence of it because we're sort of anonymous out there. We're hoping that nobody really wants to follow us. Nobody really wants to know where I was all day today. But if somebody wanted to, they could. And I think one of the things that I'm struggling with a little bit as I'm moving forward in time is the technology of surveillance is changing. And if you look at some of the spy shows on television now, it's like everyone's picking up a cell phone to talk and to take the battery out to make sure that they're not seen. And so suddenly technology hijacks the script. And I think that to me diminishes the power of the story because the story is about people, and you want to stay with people. You don't want it to be about the technology. But it's easy to get overwhelmed with the numbers of things that you can do with all the technologies that is out there.
I would also say, as far as the Nazis go, that the Nuremberg Laws were an extraordinarily powerful way to control people and to divide people and to turn people against Jews or undesirables of any kind. And one of the things that struck me as I was writing, my book takes place both in 1938 Berlin and in 1945 Los Alamos, but the Nuremberg Laws were made and they were so sort of minute and silly in a way. You can't, if you're Jewish, you can't buy your bread on Sunday. Oh, well, now a month later, you're Jewish, you can't buy your bread on Sunday or Wednesday. But people adapt. We are, as you said, Paul, about, we have our cell phones. We're not really thinking about what could be done. As we talk, we adapt to what we have. And it's, is it so bad to have to buy your bread only on 5 days? No, but what happens when it becomes one day and only one shop? And everybody in that neighborhood knows if you go into that shop at that time and you've got a star on your coat, you're a Jew. And so, that's a great way to winnow the herd. It's a very scary thing. And as I was writing Hannah's War, it was the first years of Trump. And I was seeing the same kind of thing where, the first thing he did was the Muslim ban. And of course, everybody raced out to the airports and there were lawyers going, this will not stand. We will defeat this. And we did, kind of. And then, you know, there were the people at the borders in the cages, and everybody was down there, you know, protesting. And then there was another outrage and another outrage. And it was all of a sudden, well, the people they're still in the cages down there. Just nobody's really talking about it or thinking about it because we're too busy with this next outrage. And that's what was happening in Germany. It was kind of like you would just adapt to one thing and then it would get more outrageous and you'd adapt to that. And then you were off, you know, to the concentration camps. So it's, yeah, I wouldn't have wanted to be in Germany under the Nazis with any technology, frankly.
I'm looking at some of the questions. I'm going to, because we don't have a lot of time here, there's one to me from Fred Fuchs saying, Paul, have any of your novels been produced for TV, film, or whatever? And the answer is no, not yet. And then there's another question. Why have so many people who've left Wesleyan gone off into the film, television, or writing business? And we know a lot of people have gone off to film and television. There are also a very large number of writers of note. I would say that one of the ones who I like to mention in this context is Robert Ludlum, who wrote the original Bourne series. And in some ways, I always placed him as the first serious American spy novelist. So in some ways, the three of us have this predecessor who went to Wesleyan, who had a career writing about spies. But anyways, I think it's an interesting question. Wesleyan has produced a large number of men and women who have been very successful in the creative fields, film, television, and novels. And I'm curious, what do you think that is attributable to?
I guess for me, Wesleyan was really, it had a unique sort of environment for intellectual ferment. If you think about a place where you could be a myth major for 5 minutes, probably not a good idea in the long run, but still, if you think about, it's a smallish school, as we know, the Little Three, and it's a place where people, kind of feel like they could almost have a conversation about anything with anyone. And I feel like that was something I carried into my life with me, a kind of freedom to just explore what's up there, furnish it well, and speak from it.
I'll say something to that because I was in the second class of women. And one of the things that I noticed, I had gone to an all-girls school, so I had been very used to speaking my mind in, grades 3 through 12. But Wesleyan was a unique environment in that I felt just as entitled to have an opinion and just as entitled to express my opinion as the men. And I think that was pretty rare, actually. That was not the experience of a lot of women who were in early co-ed classes like at Yale, where it was quite, we've heard stories about how terrible it was. But I definitely remember feeling like the idea of learning was part of that idea was to follow your own curiosities wherever they led you. Hence that idea of whatever major you want. I did that too. I majored in theater, English, and art history, but I kind of put them all together into this idea about operatic performance that had to do with social and political change. There's a word in German that, of course, I can't remember about, that kind of work that sort of involves every art. And the fact that Wesleyan would nurture that and would support that speaks to people who have their own individual passion, which usually means people that have their own voices and have stories to tell and are kind of collecting the crumbs of what they need to tell those stories. And I do think of that as a very particular Wesleyan trait that I've seen in almost everybody I know who went to Wesleyan.
So I think that's a great place to stop. I want to thank Paul, Stephen, and Jan for being here tonight. Do not forget to purchase a copy of The Matchmakers. Links were sent in your chat, so you can easily click on those. We also have copies of Hannah's War available, so buy a copy of each of those. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
evening.
And bye, guys. Thank you.
See ya.